They built the largest civilization of the ancient world, and we cannot name a single one of its people. Cities laid out on a grid, drains running beneath the streets, public baths that anyone could walk into, trade routes that reached all the way to Mesopotamia, and not one word they wrote can be read today. Not one king can be named. We cannot say, for certain, who they were. For 100 years, the story was simple. A brilliant people rose along the rivers, built impossible cities, and then, around the year 1900 before the Common Era, vanished. That was the answer. The answer was never carved into their seals or pressed into their bricks. It was buried in their bones. And ancient DNA has finally pulled a signal out of a climate that should have destroyed it. What it found was not how these people died. It was something stranger. Where they began. For decades, the bones said nothing at all. They piled up in their thousands across the great Indus sites, and the one record that could have told us who these people were stayed locked inside them, unreadable. The reason is the climate. Ancient DNA is fragile, and the heat of Northwest South Asia is close to the worst environment on Earth for preserving it. The molecule breaks down until nothing usable is left. So the seals accumulated, and the bricks, and the skeletons, and the genetic silence at the center of the field held for a very long time. Then it broke. Researchers recovered a genome from a single woman buried at Rakhigarhi, one of the largest Indus cities in what is now the Indian state of Haryana, dated to roughly 2,500 years before the Common Era. It did not come easily. The team, led by the archaeologist Vasant Shinde, working with the geneticists Vagish Narasimhan, David Reich, and Niraj Rai, screened 61 skeletal samples to find usable material in one, and sequenced that one only after more than 100 attempts. A thin thread of evidence pulled out of a near-hopeless climate, and what it revealed quietly rearranged the whole story. The expectation, built up over a century of theorizing, was that the Indus people would turn out to be arrivals. A wave of farmers who came east from the Fertile Crescent, carrying agriculture with them and replacing whoever had been there before. Farming spread, the thinking went, and the farmers spread with it. The genome told a different story. What it showed was a fusion. The ancestry combined people who had lived in South Asia for tens of thousands of years, deep local hunter-gatherer lineages, blended with a strand of Iranian-related ancestry. And here is the detail that changes the question. That Iranian-related strand had branched off very early, long before farming was ever invented. These were not fertile crescent farmers bringing their crops north. The researchers suggested the Indus may have taken up agriculture largely on their own, though David Reich himself was careful to say their findings do not prove a separate invention of farming in South Asia. Even with that caution, the shape of the answer had moved. The question everyone had been asking, where did the Indus people come from, was the wrong question. The answer was never a single homeland or a single migrating tribe. It was a blend, formed in place, out of streams of ancestry that met in the same river valleys long before the first city rose. That is exactly why the origin never had a clean answer. There was no clean origin to find. It is worth being honest about the limits, because good science states them plainly. This is one strong genome and a handful of related samples, not 1,000. The bones are scarce, the conclusion is provisional, and a single skeleton cannot speak for a civilization that covered more than 1 million square kilometers. But there is one more thing the genome found, or rather, did not find, and it may matter most of all. There was no trace of steppe ancestry in the mature Indus population. None of the genetic signature later tied to the people who moved down from the grasslands of Central Asia. Hold on to that absence, remember it, because it is the missing fact that will, in the end, explain how this civilization disappeared. But to understand what was lost, you first have to see what this fusion of peoples actually built. Begin with the scale, because the scale is almost difficult to believe. The Indus world sprawled across the northwest of South Asia, covering more than 1 million square kilometers. That is larger than its famous contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. And it was not a narrow strip of riverbank. It stretched across forests and deserts and grazing land, from the highlands down to the sea, a single cultural world spanning every kind of landscape the region had to offer. Inside that vast territory stood the cities: Harappa, Mohenjo-daro, Rakhigarhi, Dholavira, Gunwariwala. Some of them sat hundreds of kilometers apart, separated by terrain that should have made them strangers to one another. And yet they were built to the same plan, decorated in the same style, supplied through the same networks, as though a single mind had designed them all and then scattered them across a subcontinent. The engineering is where it stops feeling ancient at all. They laid their cities out on a grid, streets running in straight lines and right angles. They fired their bricks to a standard size, the same proportions used in city after city, hundreds of kilometers apart. They ran covered drains beneath the streets and channeled wastewater out of their homes at a time when most of the world had never imagined such a thing. They raised great citadels and broad public buildings, and at Mohenjo-daro, they built the structure we now call the Great Bath, a watertight pool fed and drained by its own plumbing. And here's the detail that should stop you. In Egypt and in Mesopotamia, the great monuments belonged to the few. The temples and the palaces were the property of priests and kings, raised by the elite and reserved for the elite. The Indus did something else entirely. Their grandest public buildings appear to have been open to ordinary people. The Great Bath was once assumed to be a sacred space for rulers and priests. It was later understood to have served the wider population of the city. The monuments here were not built to tower over the people. They were built to be used by them. So picture it whole. A territory larger than two of the ancient world's greatest civilizations put together. Cities scattered across deserts and floodplains, yet identical in design. Standardized bricks, planned streets, indoor drainage, public works open to all. An entire civilization that ran with the precision of a machine and the openness of a community. And running it all was that fusion of peoples, the blend formed in place out of deep local lineages and an ancient Iranian-related strand. They did not inherit this world from conquerors. They built it themselves, out of villages across thousands of years. A people who built all of this should be the easiest civilization in history to know. They left us their cities, their tools, their seals, their bones. They left writing on nearly everything they made, pressed and carved into the small clay and stone objects they carried through their daily lives. By every reasonable measure, this should be a civilization we can read like an open book. And it is the hardest civilization in the ancient world to understand. We can walk their streets and stand in their bathhouses and hold the seals they pressed by hand. We still cannot tell you who they were. We cannot read a line of what they wrote. Because for all the order they built into the world around them, the Indus left behind a silence so complete that a century of scholars has not been able to break it. And that silence is the next thing we have to confront. This is the best documented silence in the ancient world. The Indus left seals by the thousand, and nearly every one of them carries writing. Short rows of symbols, pressed and carved into the clay and stone with real care. We have the script. We hold it in our hands, in vast quantity, recovered from across the whole sweep of their world. And we cannot read a word of it, not one. No scholar has cracked it. Generations have tried, with grammars and statistics and computers, and the symbols have given up nothing that holds. Part of the difficulty is the script itself. There are a few hundred distinct signs, more than a simple alphabet would need, and fewer than a fully spelled out language might use, and the inscriptions are painfully short. Most run to only a handful of symbols. The longest single sequences reach perhaps 17. There is no long text anywhere, no chronicle pressed into a tablet, nothing that runs on for a paragraph and lets a codebreaker find the pattern inside it. And there is no key, no bilingual inscription, no Indus version of the Rosetta Stone, nothing that pairs these symbols with a language anyone can already read. It runs deeper than that. We do not know what language these people spoke. We cannot say for certain that the marks even record speech at all. Some researchers, among them Steve Farmer, Richard Sprout, and Michael Witzel, have argued that the inscriptions are too short and too irregular to be true writing, and may instead be symbols of another kind entirely. Others, including the computer scientist Rajesh Rao and his colleagues, have countered that the sequences carry a statistical structure consistent with language. That argument is not settled. We are not only failing to read the script, we are still debating what kind of thing it is, and the cost of that silence is total. Because we cannot read them, we have no name for a single Indus king, no name for a god we can confirm, no law code, no chronicle, no treaty, no prayer we can understand. The entire political and religious life of a civilization that spanned more than 1 million square kilometers, that lasted for the better part of 1,000 years, sits behind a wall of symbols we cannot open. We can hold the seal a merchant once owned, the very object he pressed into wet clay to mark what was his, and we cannot read what it says about him. We can stand in the room where he lived and not know his name, his rank, his city, or his god. So consider what that leaves us. Of all the things a great civilization produces to announce itself, the Indus left 2 kinds of witness that might still speak. The first is the script, and the script, for now, is mute. The second is the bones. And the bones, slowly, against a climate built to destroy them, have begun to talk. They have already told us where these people came from. They have told us that no conqueror imposed himself on the bloodline, and they are beginning to answer questions the writing never will, questions we could not even ask until the genome was read. There is one of those questions that stands out above the rest. It is the strangest thing about the Indus, stranger even than the silence of the script. Across more than 1 million square kilometers, across 10 centuries of grandeur, this civilization left us no kings. And that absence, it turns out, is not an accident of preservation. It is a clue. We have found no kings. That sounds like a small thing. It is not. Every great civilization of the ancient world announces its rulers. Egypt has its pharaohs, buried in tombs of gold, their names carved 1,000 times over. Mesopotamia has its god kings, towering in stone above rows of conquered enemies, their victories pressed into every public wall. This is what power does in the ancient world. It builds monuments to itself. It writes itself into the record so that no one can forget who ruled. The Indus, across more than 1 million square kilometers and 1,000 years of grandeur, left us almost nothing of the kind. The debate began with the first excavators, and it has never fully ended. One of them, Sir John Marshall, looked at the city of Harappa and saw something remarkable. The houses were of similar size. There were no vast palaces lording over humble huts, no quarter of the city set obviously above the rest. He concluded that the Indus were an egalitarian people, a society without kings. Another, Sir Mortimer Wheeler, looked at the same ruins and saw the opposite. The great buildings, he believed, were restricted to a ruling elite, the seats of priest kings commanding a centralized state. Scholars have taken both sides ever since, but the ground keeps tilting toward Marshall. Look at the burials, and the silence is deafening. Across the Indus world, the graves are strikingly plain. Very few contain the rich grave goods, the gold and the worked treasure that mark out a ruling class in every other ancient society. People were buried much alike, the powerful and the ordinary lying down in the earth on nearly the same terms. And the grand buildings, the ones Wheeler imagined as palaces, keep turning out to be public. The Great Bath was open to the city, not sealed away for the few. Then remember where most of these people actually lived. Not in the famous cities at all. The overwhelming majority of the Indus population lived in small rural villages, self-sufficient communities working the land. And they worked it with real intelligence, practicing intercropping, growing different plants in turn, and letting the soil rest and recover. A sustainable method South Asian farmers still use today. The villages were the true foundation. The cities sat on top of them. Even the question of war points the same way. Archaeologists have found tools that could have served as weapons, so the Indus were not perfect pacifists. But these objects are few, and they appear mostly in the cities. There is no sign of a society organized around conquest. No monuments to slaughter, no evidence of armies on the march. And now the genome speaks to all of it. Remember what the bones at Rakhigarhi revealed. A people formed by fusion, not by conquest. A people spread thin across an enormous land with no genetic sign of a foreign elite imposed from outside. Put the two records side by side and they say the same thing. The graves say no kings. The DNA says no conquerors. They agree. This was a decentralized, broadly equal, remarkably peaceful civilization governed by something we still do not fully understand, but governed without the towering rulers that every other ancient world produced, which only deepens the real mystery. A society this stable, this prosperous, this content, a people who had built impossible cities and spread them in peace across a subcontinent, should not simply fade away. They had every reason to endure. And yet, beginning around the year 1900 before the Common Era, the cities they had raised so carefully began, one by one, to empty. The question is why? The disappearance did not begin with a catastrophe. It began with a slow fading. We call this stretch the Late Harappan period, running from around 1900 to 1300 years before the Common Era, and it was not a sudden fall. There was no single fire, no final battle, no day the cities died. Instead, there was a slow urbanization, and it was not even uniform. Whole neighborhoods fell out of use while others nearby carried on. The cities did not collapse in an afternoon. They emptied gradually, street by street, over generations, until the great planned grids were quiet and the people who had filled them were somewhere else. The theories about why have multiplied for a century, so take them one at a time, beginning with the most famous and the most wrong. The Aryan invasion. The idea that Indo-European speakers swept down from the north and conquered the region by force, ending the Indus world and ushering in a new age. For a long time, this was the standard answer, and it rested more than anything on a single haunting image. A cluster of human skeletons found in the upper levels of Mohenjo-daro, scattered in lanes and rooms rather than buried with care. To Sir Mortimer Wheeler, excavating in the 1940s, they looked like the victims of a massacre, the last defenders of a city overrun. He tied them to the war hymns of the Rig Veda and declared the case all but closed. It does not survive a close look. The massacre reading was challenged by the archaeologist George Dales in 1964, and later dismantled in detail by the anthropologist Kenneth Kennedy, who studied the remains directly. There was no evidence of violent death. The skeletons did not even belong to a single moment. They came from different periods, interred in the ruins by people who used the decaying city long after its prime, and the numbers were never what the story implied. 9 years of excavation at Mohenjo-daro, a city miles around, produced only some 36 skeletons that can be tied to the Indus period at all. This was not the wreckage of a conquered capital. It was an ordinary scatter of the dead, dressed up after the fact as a battlefield. And the larger claim collapses with it. If a foreign army had stormed across the Indus world, it would have left a layer of ash and ruin behind it. Burned cities, broken walls, the unmistakable signature of conquest. Across more than 1 million square kilometers, that layer is not there. There are no sacked capitals, no fields of the slain, no conquered land. The invasion theory does not merely lack a few details, it lacks the destruction it requires to be true. But the theory has a deeper problem than missing ruins, and it is one the old debates could never reach. Because the answer to whether an army replaced these people was never going to be found in the rubble of their cities. It was waiting, the entire time, in the one record that cannot be staged or misread or argued into a battlefield. It was waiting in the bloodline. Remember the absence from the genome, the missing signature flagged at the very beginning, the steppe ancestry that simply was not there in the mature Indus population. Hold that fact up against the invasion, and the science does something the archaeology spent 100 years failing to do. It delivers a verdict, and the verdict is final. Here is the verdict. If an army had poured down from the grasslands and replaced these people, the genome would carry its mark. Steppe ancestry is not subtle. When those populations moved into a region, they left a signature in the bloodline that ancient DNA can read clearly thousands of years later. In the mature Indus population, that signature is absent. There was no wave of incomers in this period to do the destroying. The invasion theory does not just lack the burned cities and the fields of the slain, it lacks the bodies in the bloodline. It dies on the genetic evidence. This does not mean steppe ancestry never reached South Asia. It did. But it arrived later, in the second millennium before the Common Era, after the Indus cities were already emptying, mixing gradually into populations that were already rooted in the land. The work of Vagish Narasimhan and his colleagues traced that signal, and in the Swat Valley, the steppe ancestry only appears clearly after about 1200 before the Common Era. The timing is decisive. The newcomers arrived too late to have ended a civilization that was already fading on its own. They did not break the Indus world. They settled into the long aftermath of it. So if it was not conquest, what was it? The strongest answer is written in water, or rather in the loss of it. The Indus cities depended on the monsoon and on the rivers it fed, and across these centuries the climate turned against them. The summer monsoon weakened, aridity spread. The Ghaggar Hakra, the great seasonal river system along which a huge share of Indus settlements had clustered, the one often identified with the Sarasvati of later memory, began to retract and dry, its rain-fed flow failing as the rains that sustained it faltered. The farming that fed the cities had always rested on reliable floods and reliable harvests. That reliability came apart. The sharpest known dry pulse, the event climate scientists call the 4,200-year drought, struck around 200 years before the cities began to empty, which means it cannot, by itself, be the single cause. The better reading is not one disaster, but many. Repeated, prolonged droughts, returning across generations, grinding down a system that depended on steady water until the cities could no longer hold the people who lived in them. And here the whole story turns, because this was never an extinction. As the cities became unproductive, the people did exactly what their world had always allowed them to do. They left. They dissolved back into the countryside, into the villages that had been the true foundation all along. Remember that the great majority of them had always lived in those villages. There was somewhere to go, and a way of life still waiting there. You can see the adaptation in the ground. In the late period, Indus farmers shifted towards summer crops, millets, and rice, and communities moved east toward the wetter plains of the Ganges, carrying their knowledge with them. The urban experiment ended. The people did not die. A civilization assembled from a fusion did not get wiped out and replaced. It absorbed and adapted and carried on. The steppe ancestry that does sit in modern South Asians arrived afterward, mixing into a population that was already there, already rooted, already ancient. The Indus were never erased from the bloodline of the subcontinent. The cities fell silent. The people never broke. Which means the word everyone had used for them, vanished, was wrong from the start. Step back and look at what the bones have done to this story. They have answered two questions that a century of digging could not, and the two answers turn out to be the same answer, told from opposite ends. Where did the Indus people come from? They were never strangers who arrived. They were a fusion, formed in place, out of deep local lineages and an ancient Iranian-related strand that met in these river valleys long before the first wall was raised. And what happened to the Indus people? They never truly left. They dissolved into the countryside and into the bloodline of an entire subcontinent, and a part of them is carried there still. Set those two findings beside each other, and the old framing falls apart completely. For 100 years, the Indus were told as a riddle with two missing pieces, a people who came from nowhere we could name and vanished to nowhere we could find. The genome did not solve that riddle so much as dissolve it. The origin never had a clean answer because there was no clean origin to find, no single homeland, no migrating tribe, only streams of ancestry meeting and merging into something new. And the ending was never a vanishing at all. It was a dissolution, a slow return to the villages that had always been the foundation, mistaken by outsiders for a disappearance because the grand cities were what those outsiders had been watching. That is the pattern underneath the whole story. We looked for the Indus in the places where power usually announces itself, in palaces, and found public baths, in the tombs of kings, and found graves laid out much alike, in the wreckage of a conquered capital, and found only the ordinary scatter of the dead. We kept expecting this civilization to behave like Egypt or Mesopotamia, to tower and conquer and carve its rulers into stone, and at every turn it refused. It built for use instead of display. It spread in peace instead of war. It ended in migration instead of massacre. The Indus were not a fainter version of the civilizations we already knew. They were a different kind of thing, and we spent a century mistaking their difference for a mystery. But honesty has to hold the line here because the bones have not told us everything, and they cannot. They can say where these people came from and confirm that no conqueror replaced them. They cannot give us a name. They cannot tell us how a society this large governed itself without the rulers every other ancient world produced, or what its people believed, or what they called the gods they carried into their bathhouses and their fields. For that, we would need the other witness, the one that is still silent. The script remains unread. Thousands of seals, pressed and carved by people announcing something they thought worth recording, and we still cannot hear a word of it. Everything the genome has given us, profound as it is the story told by the body alone. The story told in their own voice is still locked inside those symbols, waiting for someone to find the key. And so the Indus sit in a strange half-light, no longer lost, no longer vanished, no longer strangers who came from nowhere and went nowhere, found in the blood and mute in the writing. We know, at last, that they never disappeared. We still do not know, in their own words, who they were. The largest civilization of the ancient world, cities on a grid, drains beneath the streets, baths open to anyone who walked in, a script on 1,000 seals, and not a word of it we can read. No king we can name. For 100 years, that silence was the whole story. The lost people, the brilliant cities, the vanishing with no explanation. Then the bones were read, and the story came apart one piece at a time. Not strangers who arrived, but a fusion formed in place. Not a people conquered, but a people who walked back into their own villages when the rain failed. Not a vanishing, but a dissolution into the bloodline of a subcontinent, where a part of them lives still. The cities fell silent. The people never did. We are only now learning how to listen. If this story stayed with you, subscribe. We cover the cases history got wrong.